So controlling inmate behavior, of course, is a complex task for a lot of reasons, but working conditions are often challenging due to underfunding, understaffing, overcrowding. Correctional officers often walk a fine line between two competing roles. On the one hand, they are enforcers of the rules that ensure the security of the prison. But on the other hand, they are often inmates' advocate and make rehabilitation programs available to those inmates. Of course, there are high levels of stress associated with the job, but many correctional officers report that they feel as if they can make a difference in the lives of the offenders. Women are just as effective as men correctional officers. Sexual assaults have been rare, and more negative attitudes have been expressed by the female guards, male peers, than by inmates in reference to women on the job. The presence of women may have unintended benefits in that they seem to improve the self-images of the inmates themselves. Female correctional officers may find an assignment at a male institution ends up boosting their career. Recent restrictions on male staff at female institutions have forced administrators to assign women to dormitory areas. And this really is the least desirable area for them to work. This brings us to the causes of prison violence. There's no simple explanation of what causes prison violence, but explanations can be classified into individual and collective theories. The individual theories, history of prior violence, where violent inmates do not become nonviolent just because they enter prison. Age, of course, younger inmates, those with a record of prior incarceration, and those who have suffered pre-arrest drug use are most likely to engage in prison disruptive behavior. You can guess psychological factors play in here. Prison conditions, the prison experience itself may cause violence, and lack of dispute resolution mechanisms. As you can imagine, inmates are not particularly good at resolving conflict. Prisons that don't provide formal or even informal mechanisms that allow inmates an opportunity to resolve disputes generally experience high levels of violence. And of course, we're talking about basic survival. Some violence is caused by inmates who are staking out their territory or attempting to convince other inmates just to leave them alone. Collective violence, on the other hand, there are a few theories that may explain collective violence. First, the inmate balance theory. Riots and other forms of collective violence occur when prison officials make an abrupt effort to take control of a prison and limit freedoms. And then you've got the administrative control theory, where collective violence is caused by prison mismanagement, a lack of strong security, and inadequate control by prison officials. We also see, especially as a result of the 1960s and the struggles for civil rights, we see prisoners' rights start to take shape. Prior to the 1960s, inmates were considered civilly dead, meaning that they essentially had no civil liberties by virtue of their imprisonment. This was ultimately sustained by the hands-off doctrine, or the legal practice of allowing prison administrators a free hand to run the institution, even if correctional practices violate inmates' constitutional rights. This generally ended with the onset of the prisoners' rights movement. In the 60s, advocacy groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began to file lawsuits on behalf of inmates. These lawsuits were designed to redefine the civil liberties of incarcerated persons. In 1996, the U.S. Congress passed the Prison Litigation Reform Act. This was designed to reduce litigation. It required inmates to exhaust all in-house grievance remedies before filing suit. Provisions of the Act were upheld in the Supreme Court. Booth versus Cherner deals with a request for monetary relief, and Porter versus Nussel deals with allegations of excessive force. The court ruled that it is constitutional to require that an inmate go through all administrative processes before a case can be brought to the courts. Today's incarcerated persons enjoy numerous civil liberties. Inmates are entitled to have legal materials available and must be provided assistance when drawing up and filing complaints. Only when a compelling state interest exists can the state limit the freedom of press and expression. Inmates have the right to follow the precepts of their religion unless it would create an undue burden on the facility. Inmates must have access to medical services and facilities. Cruel and unusual punishment is no longer allowed, provided for by the Eighth Amendment. This prohibits physical punishment or punishment that is far in excess of that given to people under similar circumstances. They're protected against racial segregation. In general, segregation can occur if there is a compelling interest to promote prison safety, but otherwise not so much. And overall, prison conditions have improved. This includes food, clothing, shelter, and other comforts. This brings us to what happens when we leave prison. You first start on parole, the early release of a prisoner set by a parole board. The parole board, of course, is the duly constituted body who reviews the inmate's case and decides whether they get out early or not. And there are two state models, discretionary and mandatory. Discretionary means that inmates are evaluated individually by a parole board to determine whether they are an acceptable risk. And mandatory, the inmates are given parole when the unserved portion of the maximum prison term equals the prisoner's earned good time. This brings us to the question of, is there a legal right to parole? No, there is no absolute legal right to parole. The Due Process Clause requires a fair procedure in parole hearings, but there is no absolute right. And then, of course, we have to talk about whether parole is effective or not. Despite efforts, many offenders return to prison shortly after their release. States with most success made extensive use of probation for petty offenders and programs that targeted offenders to stay away from crime and drug-free while they're on probation or parole. What does supervision look like on the outside? Normally supervised and monitored. Normally, a parolee is supervised and monitored by a parole officer. Some parole officers, as we've talked about before, maintain a social work treatment orientation, while others follow more with an authoritative attitude and more likely are looking to pursue revocation of parole. There's, of course, is a problem with reentry. The prison experience itself may contribute to reentry problems because of the socialization process. Being away from your family takes a toll. There are psychological and economic problems that lead offenders to recidivate. And ex-convicts have difficulty finding and maintaining jobs, in part because of their behavior and in part because of their record. So why do people fail on parole? Well, personal problems, economic problems, family problems, community problems, legal problems. Same thing, same reason we fail. Everybody fails. It's just that they have the complication of a record and the prison experience. How do we help people reenter? Well, we try to make them more improved than they were when they came in. And we do this by targeting attitudes and incorporating practical skills that will help them transition. Some other reasons people fail. It seems as if the system itself is set up for them to fail. The idea that you can't get work or you can't find a place to stay can be extremely problematic to a person on parole probation, because your parole probation officer is going to ask two questions almost every time you see them, and that is, do you have a job, and do you have a place to live? And are you checking in with the legal system the way that you're supposed to be checking in? The answers to those three questions can determine whether they stay out of the system or are brought back into the system due to a revocation of their parole.